in the last week, we covered chapters 9, 10, and 11, which were about aggregate supply and aggregate demands curve, and aggregate demand curves. How do we construct these curves? What do they represent? And now we're about to talk about the equilibrium. When supply meets demand in a market, we call that equilibrium. That's like, for example, a shoe market. You go and you buy yourselves a pair of shoes. There is this demand side that represents you, the buyer, and the supply side represents the sellers. At one point, you agree on the same price and the same quantity, and transactions will happen. Now, in the economy in general, in the macro side, you have thousands of different markets, millions and millions of different buyers, and millions of sellers. So what we have here is a concept that we call general equilibrium. When aggregate supply meets aggregate demand, the whole market arrives at an equilibrium. And it's like the whole markets, all markets are at equilibrium. And in that case, we call that general equilibrium. In micro, a general equilibrium is when you have like 2 or 3 different options. You have like a limited budget and you want to go buy breakfast, cereals, some milk, and a pair of shoes for yourself. How you allocate your limited budget so that you can maximize your utility and how much of each good you would buy, that is called general equilibrium. In this case, you have a nation. You have a nation that is trying to spend on everything that it produces on buying everything that she's buying. So your nation across thousands of different markets with aggregate supply and aggregate demand will arrive at a general equilibrium. Now, from before we had aggregate demand, it shows the relationship between the inflation and the level of aggregate output. In aggregate demand side of the general equilibrium, we assume that the central bank would immediately respond to a rise in inflation. It slopes downward because a rise in inflation would immediately make the central bank to respond, or in the United States, we call it Federal Reserve, would immediately make the Federal Reserve or the Fed to respond by raising the real interest rates. Why? To fight that increase in inflation, to keep inflation from getting out of control, which lowers aggregate demand and thus the equilibrium level of aggregate output. This is a very important chart. You need to have a very good explanation, an acceptable explanation on why everything in this happens. This slide happens. Real interest rate goes up. What happens if the autonomous monetary policy increases real interest rate? What happens to investment?
Goes down.
It goes down. Why? Because investment will be more costly. Real interest rate goes up. Therefore, if you want to borrow money, you have to pay a bigger interest rate. Therefore, investment would go down. Real interest rate represents the cost of holding money. To hold money, you're suffering an opportunity cost. Consumption would also go down. Why? Because your real interest rate is now higher. Instead of consuming things, you could just save them and enjoy the bigger return on your savings. So your opportunity cost of consumption, in other words, the next best thing that you can do is to save your money. And when you're not saving your money, you're spending it, you're wasting a lot of opportunities. Therefore, when R goes up, your consumption would go down. And you're also, your net exports would go down. Why? Because of the currency prices. When net real interest rate goes up, your currency would become more valuable compared to other currencies. Costs of holding money, your money will be more money. The money in your hands would be more valuable, more money. So this would cause your exporters, all those businesses all over the world, to become less competitive. This is why United States is constantly accusing China that you guys are devaluating your currency by bringing this artificially down. You're making your yuan, the Chinese currency, less valuable than it should be, and it's hurting our producers. That's a huge argument. I'm not going into how truthful is that argument. That's like, you can spend your entire career just writing research and talking about this, and it won't even cover like 10% of it. So all of that decline would lead to a decline in aggregate output. Aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. If your government purchases go up, like the New Deal during President Roosevelt, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Taxes, this is net taxes. This is the taxes that the government is taking from you and not giving you anything of it. If your taxes goes up, your consumption would go down, and therefore your output would go down. That's why governments like to give tax cuts to populations, especially in times of economic troubles, like in the 2008, 2009, President Obama did that, and in 2016, President Trump did that. They lowered taxes so that people would have more disposable income, consume more, and aggregate output would go up. Net exports, obviously, autonomous consumption expenditure goes up. All the things that we talked about, autonomous consumption and autonomous investment, would materialize here in aggregate demand. I could have like 10 questions from this alone on your final exam, and I will have like at least 5 questions from this slide alone. Every up and down here has a story, has a reason, could be an example. You need to know this. And of course, I'm not just going to give you a simple G goes up, Y goes up, Y. I will give you a scenario, a real policy-making situation, and I would want you to be able to analyze it and then pick the right option. So be prepared. When I tell you this will be on your exam, that means I will be extra adventurous about these questions. Please don't forget about this slide, and because it's summarized a few chapters that we covered so far. So
can you go over all the variables real quick again?
I just, like I did that. I am recording it and I will post on YouTube. You could just go there and check it. So autonomous monetary policy goes up, shift in demand curve. This is like, again, a representation of this situation. So these two are almost the same. Government expenditure goes up, your aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, therefore your aggregate output will increase. Always ask yourselves, how does this change affect aggregate output? And then if aggregate output goes down, that means your aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. If aggregate output goes up, then aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. So yeah. Consumer optimism, this is a very important thing. You constantly hear it on the news that consumer optimism has increased. Consumer optimism has gone up to 2016 level, for example. When COVID started, consumer optimism was one of the most important indices in economic news, because everybody was worried about how people are consuming. People were scared. Many of them lost their jobs. They were like, what if I don't go back to work? What if I also lose my job, like my friends are losing their jobs right now? So people wouldn't consume that much, wouldn't spend money that much. This caused lots of unemployment on top of all the unemployment caused by COVID shutdowns and lockdowns. And it caused a huge problem. And in fact, this was like one of the reasons that Stiglitz said, forget about all the stuff you're doing right now, and please first get rid of COVID. Because until you don't get rid of COVID, people will not have their confidence again to go out there and spend money. Even if you like vaccinate like 50% of the population and open up the economy, still, whenever I want to go out, I will like, yeah, what about this new variant? What's about that? What should I do? Should I go meet my grandma next week? Then I was just outside. Maybe I put her in danger, and obviously nobody likes to do that. So all that fear would decrease your optimism, would push you out of the market, and it would actually be a burden on top of everything else. So this is why COVID became such a maze of trouble and like these scary movies that a wrong term, there is a monster that would eat you. So yeah, business optimism, same ideas about consumer optimism, and financial frictions. So covered that. And now, economists refer the word autonomous to the component of the variable that is exogenous. When you say autonomous investment, it means that it's not created inside the market. It's something outside, a culture, people's confidence, like COVID, things like that. COVID doesn't sit on the board of Federal Reserve, so he's not deciding things inside the market, but COVID influences the market from the outside. So that's why autonomous consumption is an exogenous term. It comes from the outside. Autonomous monetary policy is the component of the real interest rate set by the central bank that is unrelated to any variable in the market. That's just something that is there. So by changing changes in supply and demand, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, autonomous real interest rate doesn't change. That's for other reasons, political reasons, historical reasons, legal reasons. Sometimes central banks, because they did some really interesting achievements before, they are tied by laws in some countries that you can't just do anything you want. Like the last time you caused the civil war, this time you're going to behave yourself. So they could be like legal boundaries that would influence this. These are things from outside. Changes in autonomous variables are not associated with movements along the curve, but shifts. So when something inside the model changes, you would move on the curve. You will respond to it by moving the curve, by moving on the curve, because you're inside the model. But when something from the outside changes, the model itself changes. Curves will shift up and down. The whole situation changes because the model you have is only explaining certain things. And when other things that are not being explained by the model changes, therefore your model must change to accommodate this new situation. So one more time, changes in autonomous variables are not associated with movements along a curve, but shifts in the curve. Now, short and long run aggregate supply, wages and prices are sticky in the short run, Keynesian assumption, but fully flexible in the long run, Milton Friedman. The- who is talking? Please mute yourself. Excuse me. Who was it talking? Please.
Tristan, you're unmuted.
Yep, I got him. Okay, where will we? Short run and long run. Yep, here. Wages and prices are sticky in the short run. That's the Keynesian assumption, and fully flexible in the long run, Milton Friedman. Now, the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical. Go ahead, Jose.
Professor, I had a question. I believe it was 2 slides ago that you were talking about the Federal Reserve. And as I'm sure you know, yesterday they had a statement regarding monetary policy. And since it's such like an interesting time in macroeconomics because of the pandemic,
Yeah.
I was looking at over the statement yesterday, and I was wondering, because you were saying that they have to keep real interest rates high, I believe that's what you said, in order to, I don't know if that's what you said, but yesterday they were stating that they have to remain with the interest rates between 0 and 0.25% in order to stimulate more employment in the economy for the next quarters, and that's gonna keep the inflation rate just above 2% in order to balance it out at a 2% average. I don't know if you have like anything to add on to that to like better understand it in the long term.
Well, I have to like look at the whole statement myself, but also you should also know that those guys, they're being paid much more than I am being paid, and they know their job much better than I know that. But jokes aside, what they're doing actually shows that the economy has not yet recovered. You see, here, this shows a really nice thing. It slopes downward because a rise in inflation leads to monetary policy authorities to raise real interest rates to keep inflation from getting out of control, which lowers demand and thus the equilibrium level of the output. This is the good time story. Now we're in the bad time story. You should read it the opposite way.
Okay.
Right now, aggregate demand is low. There is a recession. Like, I'm pretty sure President said that we're going to have a 6% economic growth rate, and that was like a recovery, which was probably what shaped my initial statement. I said that like if this happens, they have to bring it down to prevent inflation from getting out of control. But right now, what you said, that means that the economy is still in trouble. So aggregate demand and equilibrium output levels are too low, lower than the equilibrium level, which we could say was the situation in 2009 before COVID arrives. So by lowering interest rates, this is what they're trying to do in the short run again. Remember, these are short run numbers. By lowering interest rates, they're going to try to increase inflation. By causing inflation, your aggregate demand curve here shifts to the right. See here. Where is it? This goes up. Federal Reserve says go up. This is the demand side again. Let's say, yep, you want to increase this. If you want to increase this, you want to create inflation. By raising inflation, how do you raise inflation? By lowering real interest rates. You would raise inflation from last chapter, remember? We talked about aggregate supply. Then it would shift the curve to the right, and then you will arrive at the higher aggregate output. A good example of this is the 1960s, President Nixon. In that time, they kept creating inflation and pushing aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and causing an increase in aggregate output. So by creating inflation, you push aggregate supply curve to the left, to the right, excuse me. But aggregate demand curve responds when next period, the central bank or Federal Reserve sees that inflation is getting out of control. Right now, we're not even there, according to the Federal Reserve, that we are not facing that kind of threat yet. We have bigger fish to fry. Like if you remember yesterday, I told you that unemployment causes 4 times as much misery as inflation. So people care about unemployment more. And there are still thousands of people that are not employed and they're not happy with that. So by creating inflation, you create output in the short run. And then I hope that after recovery has completed and we're back on our feet, then they will lower interest rates, increase interest rates to lower inflation and bring us back to the general equilibrium. Let's see this, Alec. That was a very good question. I will read that statement today and talk about it tomorrow. Of course, you must also understand that this is like the person who wrote this book, and like economists oftentimes fail to understand the real issues that politicians have. Politicians often have like bigger concerns. So you must, like as an advisor, when you, for example, talking to the president, you're saying do this, do that, because the economy will do this, do that. But there are also other advisors. There are also lobbyists. There are also lots of, like thousands and thousands of different interests, people pushing their own agenda. If you're a senator from Oklahoma, you want something that the senator from California may not want that. You may want something else. And these people, they're all pushing to represent their own constituency with different interests. And this is also what, in many occasions, affect decision makers and policymakers. So it's not always like the president sits in the Oval Office and says, like, Jimmy, bring the macroeconomic textbook and let's see what we should do. That's not the case. In many cases, that's the result of all those folks negotiating and pushing for their own objectives. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, short run and long run aggregate supply curve. Wages and prices in the short run are sticky. So last time we talked about this by playing with the aggregate supply curve. The government knows that it's sticky. So by creating inflation, you would want people to have more money. Therefore, they would think, oh my God, I'm more wealthy. They would spend more money and aggregate output will increase. But fully flexible in the long run. In the long run, there is no story. It doesn't matter what's the real interest rate or inflation or any of this is. In the long run, what matters is that how many workers do you have? Do they know what they're doing? Are they trained enough? Do they have adequate tools and capital? Do they have enough, like good technology, competent managers, like efficient leadership, or no, they're just running around doing what they want to do? All of this real stuff, not the interest rate and things. So the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. This is why it's vertical. It doesn't respond to inflation or real interest rate. It responds to how many workers you have, how many factories you have, and other things, other real things. Is vertical at the potential output level, this, which is determined by available factors of production, labor and capital, and technology, real stuff, as well as the natural rate of unemployment. That 5% we talked about yesterday, that's if your unemployment rate is like 3%, that's below the natural rate. And in time, 2% of those people who are working, they would leave the labor force because they want to go back to do what they were doing and just probably just collect those unemployment benefits and things like that. The short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. As output rises relative to potential, inflation rises. This is why the Federal Reserve keeps increasing inflation and causing inflation by lowering interest rates. This is why, in fact, every politician wants it. Like even in 2019 and 2018, when the situation was pretty good, like US economy was actually really good in 2019. Still, if you followed President Trump on Twitter, every couple of weeks he was like, that guy, like the head of the central bank, he putting pressure on him. That was his way of putting pressure on like people, that he should do what? He should lower interest rate. And it was a very smart kind of political fight, trying to persuade the head of the Federal Reserve to lower that between banks interest rate, therefore causing inflation, to make the situation even better, to increase the short-term aggregate output. The short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So by raising inflation, by causing inflation, you would increase output. And even today, like as Jose said, now they're trying to do that to make the economy recover faster. Factors that shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. You're talking about the long run here. Now you can't use magic tricks and like take a rabbit out of your hat or things like that. In the long run, it's serious. Shocks to the natural rate of unemployment. Shocks to technology. Is it like shock? By shock, I mean a good thing or a bad thing. Are you improving your stock of technology? Are your scientists well-funded? Are they publishing new research? Are they achieving new, like making new devices? Is Elon Musk doing what he does best, or is he trading in Bitcoin? Things like that. Shocks to long-run changes in the amounts of labor or capital that affect the amount of output that the economy can produce. Labor and capital, saving rates, things we are studying in the Solow model. These are the things that would decide the situation in the long run. Factors that shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. Short run, it's about inflation. Right now, for example, expected inflation. Higher expected inflation leads to an upward and leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve. Price shocks, supply restrictions, or workers pushing for higher wages leads to an upward and leftward shift in the short-term aggregate supply curve. Higher wages, yep, like unions. Labor unions suddenly go on a strike. They would force their employers to give them a better pay. The employer still needs to make money, would have to increase his prices, and that would be a negative supply shock. It will raise prices without actually adding anything to the aggregate, which then causes like just inflation out of nowhere without changing the short-term supply. So it would lead to an upward and leftward shift in the short-term aggregate supply curve. Persistent output gap, a persistent positive output gap leads to an upward and leftward shift in the short-term aggregate supply. Why? Because it means that the economy is producing too much, it's overheating. So basically it needs to come back. This is what people said about the US economy during the Vietnam War, that you're just producing too much that you should be producing. So like you're overheating the economy by all this inflation and everything. So the economy needs to come down. Therefore, an upward or leftward shift in the aggregate supply. Expected inflation goes up, supply curve shifts up or shifts to the left. Price shocks. If a price shock is a positive price shock, something like, for example, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, Yom Kippur, or Arabs call it Ramazan War. If that happens, oil prices would go out of control, like went really high. That would be a really bad price shock, and it would it would make the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left and up. Now, general equilibrium, we talked about this in detail, occurs when all markets are simultaneously in equilibrium at the point where the quantity of aggregate output demanded equals the quantity of aggregate output supplied. Generally, graphically, the general equilibrium when aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. Short-term and long-run equilibriums exist because there are two aggregate supply curves, one for the short run and one for the long run. So right now, when the central bank, when the Federal Reserve wants to play with the interest rates, is for the short run. They just want to get rid of this COVID disaster, this crisis, to just go away, be fixed. When the economy is back at normal, things will go back to normal. That would then, after COVID is gone, then will be the long run. In the short run, you can see this. This is a beautiful, simple illustration. Short-run equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply intersect. This. I would like to I don't know how correct that is, but that helped me understand this. Aggregate supply is an active thing, but aggregate demand is a reactive. It doesn't act, it reacts. Aggregate demand reacts to the changes in inflation because aggregate demand knows that when inflation goes up, the central bank or Federal Reserve would immediately increase the interest rates, real interest rates, to lower inflation back. That would make it respond. But aggregate supply, it responds first. It's like first in line. Aggregate demand is behind it. So this is not really like a theoretically correct thing to say, but it helps me to understand this whole situation difference between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. A rise in inflation leads the monetary policy authorities to raise real interest rates. Therefore, it would keep inflation from getting out of control and lowers aggregate demand. And this is a very important slide as well. I will give you the two curves. How do you find the equilibrium? At equilibrium points, outputs and inflation rates are equal. Therefore, you just change one for the other. For example, in this aggregate demand curve, you find output in terms of inflation and then put it in the aggregate, the short-run aggregate supply curve here. Substitute it for pi from aggregate supply into the aggregate demand, or in my case, do the opposite. It doesn't matter. If you put this part instead of pi in this curve, in this equation, or if you put this instead of this, you will arrive at the same results. Substituting in for pi from aggregate supply curve into aggregate demand curve so that equilibrium y would be this. And now you just have one equation with one unknown. You will solve it easily. Collecting terms in y so that y star would equal 10. If it's 10, then 10 would be equal 10 minus 10 would be equal to 0. Therefore, you have 11 minus 1, which is 10. Yes. So if you solve this, y star equals 10, which is substituted into the short run aggregate supply curve to yield the equilibrium inflation rate. In aggregate supply and demand analysis, even when the economy is at the intersection of aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve, the equilibrium will move over time if output differs from its potential level. So if your short-run equilibrium output is different, is more than potential level, it would have to initially come back to the real potential value. And if it's less than the potential level, it would have to go up. If the current level of inflation changes from its initial level, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift as wages and prices adjust to a new expected rate of inflation. What happens to the short-run equilibrium over time if the short-run equilibrium output is initially above potential output? What happens if you are initially above potential output, like in the Vietnam era, economy was overheating? Then tightness in labor markets drive up wages. When wages go up, everything that's being produced will become more expensive. This is why some people argue for an increase in minimum wage. They say just increase minimum wage and prices would go up. That wouldn't be that wouldn't hurt anyone, but it would help the low-income people a lot. They would have more disposable income in their pockets. You, instead of paying $5 for your cheeseburger, you pay $6. That $1 wouldn't change anything for you, but for the person who receives $15 an hour instead of 7.25, that would mean a lot. That would mean a lot. These are like one side of the argument. The other side says, no, they will not do it because of all the competition. They will just start firing people. They will just, so you'll have lots of low-income people who are now no-income people. They will just lose their job. These are two different arguments. What happens when there is a tightness in labor market, when the economy is overheating, everybody is fighting over how to get workers, like, here, come work for me, come work for me. And how do you increase, how do you hire people when everybody wants them? By offering them more money. For example, if you're, let's say, if you're an experienced engineer, or you're a very good student, you have all the straight A's, and you just got your engineering degree, you apply to these companies, and these companies will offer you a salary. They would offer you a bigger salary to get you to work for them. So that would help you. That's why your GPA is a very important term. I really wish I had someone tell me this. I had to learn it the hard way, that why I should care about my GPA. I was taught that it's a number, as long as you pass, it doesn't matter. But then I realized, no, it matters. And it was like, yeah, kind of late. But yeah, you see, if you have your GPA real high, you will get better offers. That better offer would mean higher wages. Higher wages would then mean higher prices. Higher prices in the CPI, higher inflation. And therefore, next period, backward looking inflation from last chapter yesterday, next period, you will have real, you will have higher inflation expectations. And then even more higher inflation. Thus, the aggregate supply curve shifts up because this would be sustainable. It would shift up and to the left over time. Yesterday we saw this. It will shift up to the left. And therefore, you will arrive back to your potential output level. Now, what happens to the short-run equilibrium over time? If the short-run equilibrium output is initially below potential output, if the economy, for example, right now, what's happening right now? Let's see. Excess slack in labor markets drives down wages, which result in lower inflation and inflation expectations. Thus, the aggregate supply curve shifts right down and to the right over time to increase potential output. Here, this is what's happening right now. Let's first, this should have been here, this slide. Let's see what happens. Now, let's say economy is overheating. We're in 1967. Excess tightness in labor market increases expected inflation and shifts the aggregate supply curve upward from here to here, then here. So your inflation goes up and up and up, and this would cause your aggregate output to go down. So the economy returns to the potential level of output. But then, what if we're here? If you're here, excess slack in the labor market decreases expected inflation and shifts the aggregate supply curve downward. So excess slack in the labor market means that lots of people are unemployed, and this would cause lower wages. Lower wages would cause a drop in inflation, and this would then make the economy return to the potential level of output that it was. Now, right now in COVID crisis, this is why I told you that these guys are making decisions. They're getting paid more than me, and they know stuff more than me. One thing that I personally suspect this, I don't want to create something, is that they want to use COVID crisis now to make aggregate, equilibrium wages to go up. Like right now, COVID is not the only problem. One of the reasons that this whole situation is being made is because that all those checks that people received as stimulus checks are literally encouraging people to not go back to work by making the opportunity cost of leaving home higher. See, I'm getting paid right now. I'm sitting at home with a bag of Doritos, watching TV and getting paid. I am really enjoying my life. I don't really like to work. Not everybody likes work. If sometimes, I would say most times, your workplace is not really a nice place and people are not really your friends there. Like usually, this is at least in my personal experience, usually you prefer to stay home with the bag of Doritos. Now that you're being paid, it would make you not leave the house. Why do people work? Why am I here right now? Do I like to talk to myself, looking at my own face, talking about all that theories and stuff? No, I'm here because I'm getting paid. If someone would call me right now, Ahad, I am paying you, stay home and I'm paying you. Okay, yes, sir. Oh, I like that very much, sir. Thank you. I would do that. By doing that, at the same time causing inflation, making companies have more money, What they're trying to do is that they're at the same time that they're, this is my personal guess, okay? You may not like it, and I don't have like proof for that yet. I've heard some stuff and I actually like this and I support what they're doing right now. I hope that's what it is. And by creating that overheating economy, they're trying to push towards companies to be motivated and incentivized to pay higher wages so that after we're out of COVID, you wouldn't have people working for $7.25. You would have people receiving even higher wages. So after the whole problem is over, we won't go back to 2019. We go back to 2023 or 24 in a better situation. This is what I'm guessing that they're doing. This is why I said that like these folks, they know this stuff better than I do, and they know what they're doing, and they have lots of different negotiations and arguments. So this is my take on the whole COVID situation. And I hope that is achieved. I hope actually after crisis is over, people are being paid more, and therefore the whole equilibrium shifts to the right. So, Prem, is that you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, isn't one of the negative side effects of it though that if wages don't go up, production just goes down. So basically, like companies are saying that we can't afford to put these workers on, and so instead we'll just have to lower the number of employees and downscale.
If wages are too high, you say.
Yeah, if wages are too high.
Yeah, but if you at the same time, if you lower inflation, if you lower interest rate, which is happening right now, and make investments cheaper, so it's like I don't know. It's like
So you mean like putting
I would. Have you heard the term carrots and a stick?
Yeah.
It's like I give you, not you, like the person in front of me. I give that person a carrot and then I hit him with a stick. These two would cancel each other. But then who would win? The person who is about to get paid. He will end up getting paid higher. At least that's my guess. I really didn't expect that to happen. I thought that they would just like try to combat inflation, because I heard that the economy is about to go like 6% growth, and it was like, that's great. But now there is a different story. So we'll have to see.
Yeah.
So this is what happens when you're below equilibrium. Your excess slack in the labor market decreases expected inflation, and therefore it would shift your aggregate supply curve to the right until you arrive back at the potential output level. Now, according to the aggregate demand and supply model, regardless of where output is initially, it eventually goes back to the potential. So all this you're doing right now, it won't matter in the long run. What matters in the long run, again, technology, investment, labor, real things. Are you building the schools? Pushing your head of central bank to increase inflation won't help you. Build a school, that would help you. Save more money, invest, give loans to corporations, like companies and business owners. That would help you. According to aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, you would eventually arrive back at the potential output. This is called the self-correcting mechanism, because the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up or down to restore the economy to full employment over time. Aggregate supply curve shifts up or down, again, to restore the economy to full employment. By full employment, I don't mean unemployment equals 0. No, unemployment equal natural rate of unemployment, the 5%. Aggregate output at potential. Demand shocks are factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Up to this point, we talked about aggregate supply. Now talked about aggregate demand. Positive demand shocks cause a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Results, although the initial short-term effect of the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, positive demand shocks cause a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, which means although the initial short-term effect of the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve is a rise in both inflation and output, the ultimate long-run effect would be only a rise in inflation, because your output would eventually return back to the potential level and you'll only be left with the increased inflation. Here, you can see this. Let's say there is a positive demand shock. In the short run, your aggregate demand, you're here, aggregate demand here shifts to the right. You will be here. This would increase output and inflation. At the same time, your aggregate supply also will respond. So step 3, so your aggregate supply would then shift upward. You see what happened? And this is difficult, like it even confuses me. When you're experiencing an increase in inflation and output, how does it change aggregate supply? Previous chapter. Remember we said expected inflation is backward looking. We analyzed the changes in aggregate supply. This is what happens. Let's look at this separately. A positive output gap, or like an increase in output, would lead to an increase in inflation. That increase in inflation, a persistent increase in inflation, would cause even more increase in inflation. So you will keep up, you will keep going up. So this is what happens. You go up. When you go up, you go from point 2 then to point 3 to a new equilibrium. Therefore, the economy returns to long-run equilibrium. So all that you achieved by pushing demand side to the right will be lost because supply side will go back. And in the end, you will return where you started with only one difference, more inflation rate. And of course, in the meantime, you might say, okay, what's the point of it? Some people, the Austrians, for example, they say you achieved nothing. You just wasted time. You probably made a few of your friends rich. You did nothing, and you should not play with this. You should just go sit in the corner and do nothing. Others say, well, what you achieved was that those folks who were unemployed during the crisis could go to work in this period, and they could pay the tuition fees for their kids' schools and their education. So their kids didn't fall behind. And now that it's back at before, yes, your inflation went up, but instead of having kids whose education were lost, or investment opportunities that were lost, or people that were just aged without opportunities, you managed to catch up. So this is the point. And it's a huge debate. I don't really know which one of them is right exactly. Whether we should do this, I mean, you're going to end up back at the long-term output anyway, and just more inflation. So why would you do it? But then at the same time, if you don't do it, all those people who lost their jobs and everything, they will fall behind. Time is money. If you fall behind, you're lost. In fact, I think there were research about the social costs of a financial recession. Like imagine if you're working at a factory, you have 2 kids, you lose your job, your income's gone, and your children won't be able to end up like a member of the middle class like you were. This is what I saw like with my own eyes. When I saw a family like a one-wage earner, father was working, the mom was a stay-at-home spouse, they lost their job, their children couldn't like keep up. The kids later couldn't go to college, and they just like the whole trajectory of their life changed. So this makes sense if you're facing this kind of situations to just play with the inflation and end up at a higher inflation rate, just to not lose those people who are about to fall behind. So complicated stuff. Now, suppose the aggregate demand curve shifts rightward by $2 trillion, so that Y in the aggregate demand equation is equal to this. The intercept just increased by 2 trillion. Substituting in for pi, which is this from the aggregate supply, you'll have this. To find the new equilibrium, collecting terms, your new equilibrium would be 11 trillion, which in turn is substituted into the short-run aggregate supply, which gives you this new inflation. This new inflation, again, this value of output in the aggregate demand, you will have this inflation. So from 2%, by pushing for more demand, we arrive to 3.5%, and by changing supply, we arrived in 5%. First, we pushed the demand to change, then demand changed, then supply reacted, and then we ended up at the first point with just higher inflation. So in the long run, you have this, and substituting this, you have 5.5. Let's look at this historical example. When Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, the inflation rate exceeded 10%. Volcker was determined to get inflation down by raising the federal funds rate, that interest rate between banks, federal funds rate. By raising federal funds rate, suddenly inflation would go down. High real interest rates brought inflation down from 13.5 in 1980 to almost 2%, which is great in 86, while the unemployment rate initially soared. So we went backward here. Unemployment rate initially soared. But then our aggregate demand and supply analysis correctly predicts what happened in this period here. First, new person comes, lowers inflation rate. Monetary policy tightening decreases aggregate demand. Aggregate demand goes down from here to here. Point 1, you would go to point 2. A movement along the aggregate supply. But then aggregate demand will respond. Let's see. Yeah, it would lower output, therefore, from Y potential to yield 2, and your inflation rate is low. This low new inflation and lower output would then shift aggregate supply downward. So your aggregate supply will respond by going down. And therefore, at point 4, you would arrive back where you started with a lower inflation rate. Output again would increases to potential output, and inflation declines further to your pi tree. So one more time. First, monetary policy tightening decreases aggregate demand. I hear you said, just give me a second. You will raise federal funds rate, you will reduce inflation rate. Your aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. You go from point 1 to point 2. After that, suddenly supply wakes up, supply responds. Your aggregate supply curve would then move to the right. This would cause you to have a second aggregate supply curve and a second aggregate demand curve. These two meet each other, so you'll have a second equilibrium from here to here. But what you achieved is lower inflation, which is a good thing. Go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to ask, so is aggregate supply always a lagging variable?
Not really a lagging variable.
But it reacts
check-
after aggregate demand?
Not really.
Just in this scenario.
Yeah, like let me see. Like for example, you mean compared to aggregate demand or just in general? Because like you have shocks and everything in prices for aggregate demand, like an oil shock.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so when demand moves, right, aggregate demand moves because
Yeah.
of the shocks, aggregate supply has to move after aggregate demand.
Like you see, the idea is none of this happens after the other one.
Oh, okay.
If you just like, I use that example just to make it understandable. In reality, they all move simultaneously,
Okay.
supply and demand. You see in like a fraction, like in no second, like nothing changes. Everything happens simultaneously. Have you watched these like martial arts movies like Bruce Lee and Dwayne the Rock Johnson and
Yeah.
people like that? Have you seen those fist fights? Like two professional, like they're constantly punching and kicking each other. The person who punches, you throw a punch, and at the same time that Master Shifu or something like Kung Fu Panda, that's my favorite. The person tries to like guard and like push the punch away.
Okay, so
This
it's just a
happens at the
reaction.
same time. Yes,
Okay.
simultaneously. The moment the punch arrives, the response arrives. This
Gotcha.
happens simultaneously. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But then like just to make it more understandable for you, for yourselves, you could just add like this assumptions that I would assume that this happens or that happens. That's a personal thing. If you like to assume that this happens first and then that happens, but in reality, they happen simultaneously. So this aggregate demand shifts left, and at the same time, aggregate supply would go down. So you arrive here.
So to reiterate that, the aggregate supply makes the aggregate demand react to it.
No, like depends on the situation. In fact, inflation makes both of them react. You see, inflation goes down. This would cause, in this case, this would cause what happens from point 1 to point 2. What changed?
The supply.
No, what changed?
The
Like you
demand
went
curve
from,
shifted left.
yeah, the demand curve shifted leftward. So in this case, demand curve shifted leftward. Then what happens? You have 82.
In the supply.
Then the supply shifted down. After the demand, then the supply. In reality, this happens simultaneously. They happen together. But this is just for us to better understand it. Aggregate supply is the same. It's the same curve. Let me use my tablet. This is not really an easy thing to understand. So In fact, I had a question like this on my PhD preliminary exam. I couldn't solve it in the macro sense. I used micro. Like I approached it like it's a shoe market. I remember that question was like about a macro situation, but I just ignored the whole macro thing because it was so difficult. I just assumed it's just a shoe market, some micro, and I solved that, and they accepted it. So I had the right answer, but not the exact right explanation. Let me show it this way. So let's see, we're looking at 1980. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And this is the potential level. The economy is at equilibrium at a really high inflation rate, like 13%. Then what happens? Then the government, the head of Federal Reserve, would increase federal funds rates. This would make holding money more expensive. Then this would lower inflation. When holding money is more expensive, you put your money away. You don't hold it, you would save it. All those things that we talked about in consumption and everything, at the same time, would also cause output to go down. So your aggregate supply excuse me. So your aggregate supply would shift down. Let's call this aggregate supply 2. At the same time, this happens. It's like, imagine that those, imagine Master Shifu and Kung Fu Panda, they're practicing Kung Fu. One throws a punch here. Then the other one will react. Excuse me, this is aggregate demand. This is aggregate supply. Then this one would go down. So from here, you come back here. So in the end, nothing would change. Why? Because the potential of the economy is decided by the number of workers, number of factories, number of equipment and scientists and things like that. Not the federal funds or things like that. They will go back to the potential value. But what changed is the inflation. The opposite of this is when you increase inflation, you cause inflation in the short term. So here. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Great. So
Thank
aggregate supply shifts downward and aggregate output would then arrive at the potential, would increase back to the potential, and inflation declines further to pi 3. And you can see that data also supports this. Inflation rate first went up from 7 to 9 to almost 10% in 82, but then it starts to go back. Why? Because unemployment rate is negatively correlated with output. When the economy is producing more, You need more workers, so your unemployment is low. So you arrive at the same exact situation, but with a very much lower inflation, which is better, which is really good. Why? Because inflation has costs. So application, negative demand shocks. Let's see what something goes wrong when something goes wrong. In the early 2000s, a series of negative shocks to aggregate demand occurred in the US economy. Sharp falls in the stock prices, weakening consumer and business confidence, and rises in interest rates on corporate bonds. I believe this is because the bubble, like a dot-com bubble or something like that, it was something about Yahoo Corporation. Back then, Yahoo was a very important thing. It was like before Google, Yahoo was actually the Google. So in 2000, in the early 2000, something bad happened about that. And it caused the stock prices to crash, to fall. And if you remember from our neoclassical chapter 8, the stock prices fall, that would send a signal that things are about to get bad. Weakening consumer and business confidence, and therefore rises in interest rates on corporate bonds. As a result of the leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, unemployment rose and inflation fell. By 2004, the self-correcting mechanism began to come into play. Short-run aggregate supply curve shifted downward so that output returned to its potential level, and unemployment dropped back to its natural rates. So here you can see something happened. We were here, then something bad happened. We arrived here because aggregate demand curve shifted, then aggregate supply curve responded, and we are here now. The same as before. Self-correcting mechanism. It's a negative demand shock. In this case, it was just a desire by the Federal Reserve to fix the problem of inflation. In this case, there was a shock to the market, and like a Yahoo stock prices collapsed, and all those high-tech companies, I think they suffered a huge drop in the stock prices. That huge drop in the stock prices terrorized the consumers. It lowered consumer confidence because, as we saw, it's a signal of economic recession. That caused a drop in aggregate demand. When aggregate demand fell, aggregate supply also went down, and we arrived again back at the potential level. So the market cleared itself again and corrected it automatically itself. This is what we call self-correcting mechanism. The aggregate supply curve can shift from two types of supply curves. Two types of supply shocks. First of all, temporary shocks that do not shift the long-run aggregate supply, or permanent supply shocks that cause the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift. This could be a good thing or could be a bad thing. For example, when in 2000, I think it was before 2008, oil prices were like $120 per barrel. It was super high, like super high. Oil-rich countries, they were really happy. I tell you, like, you would sell something for 5 times the price of yesterday, and this was good. It was a good time. Everybody was happy. But then what happened is that Americans, because of all the long-term elasticity of the market, Americans and British and everyone started to go after fracking, to dig really deep in the ground and to try to get oil. That made supply of oil to increase, and it changed the long run, because now oil prices can probably never go back to like $120 per barrel. As soon as it reaches 80 or something, all those fracking will start again. They will produce, and meet the demand. So even if tomorrow the whole Middle East is like, I don't know, the earth open up and Middle East just goes into the ground and the earth closes its mouth, no more oil supply from there, is still fracking can prevent an increase in prices like that. So that would be a good supply price shock. A bad price shock, let's say there is a the Paris Agreement that would put certain limitations. It's not like a bad thing. The Paris Agreement itself is not a bad thing, but it would create a negative supply shock, a negative price shock. How? By increasing the ultimate, by decreasing the supply of lumber. Why? According to Paris Agreement, you can't just go like crazy with the chainsaw and deforest an entire planet. You need to calm down. Less deforestation. This would reduce the supply of lumber. This would increase the price of lumber, therefore. And it would cause a negative supply shock to the economy that would, in the long run, change everything. More expensive lumber, more expensive houses, less money available for me if I have to. If this house is more expensive, then the rent of this house would be more expensive. Then every month I will have less money in my pocket, less disposable income. So this would be a negative price shock. But these will be permanent. Now, yes, it's called a negative or unfavorable supply shock. Shifts the short-term supply curve to the left. Less supply available, initially causing a situation of rising inflation and falling output. This is called stagflation. This is a really bad thing. In this case, you have rising inflation and reduction in output at the same time. This is when aggregate supply changes first, not aggregate demand. Before here, aggregate demand changed, then aggregate supply responded. In this case, aggregate supply first shifted to the left. Demand stayed the same. You have stagflation. An example of a stagflation and this negative supply shock is international sanctions. For example, in Iran, because of all the geopolitical problems, suddenly international sanctions were imposed. And these international sanctions, they caused inflation and a stagnation at the same time, because aggregate supply suddenly shifted to the left, causing a situation of rising inflation and falling output. And then, although a temporary negative supply shock leads to an upward and leftward shift in short-run supply, which raises inflation and lowers output at the same time, therefore stagflation, the ultimate long-run effect is that output and inflations are unchanged. This here, there is a shock. In the short run, you go here. So the temporary negative supply shock shifts aggregate supply left, therefore increasing inflation and decreasing output. The opposite would be a positive supply shock. Something good happens, like let's say cheaper oil prices. cheaper oil prices is always like a good thing for the economy. It makes everything cheaper. Like businesses, communications, transportations, everything would be more profitable. So the whole economy would enjoy. This is why gas prices are very important. People care about gas prices. Why? Because it's a broad thing. It affects everything. Positive or favorable. Shifts the short-term supply down. The short-run aggregate supply down and to the right, initially causing a situation of falling inflation and rising output, the opposite of stagflation. It's the best of the both worlds. Not only your inflation falls, your output is also going up, so you're very happy. A temporary positive shock shifts the short-term aggregate supply downward and to the right. Therefore, initially, fall in inflation and a rise in output. In the long run, however, output and inflation would be unchanged because the number of workers and everything else, that's the thing. Now, let's finish here. We have just a little bit more to cover. You don't need to worry about the appendix. So let's finish here, 1973. Yes, the oil embargo, yeah. So we'll pick it up from here. And tomorrow will be our last class. We'll talk about this and then about the final exam a little bit. And we'll never see each other again, hopefully, if you don't fail. So, any questions? If not, let me take attendance for the last time. Tomorrow, there's no attendance. Is there any questions? Good,
No,
perfect. So,
Is the final
Brandon,
going to be,
excuse
yeah,
me?
Yeah, is the final going to be on Monday?
Yes, August 2nd. Yeah,
That's in the
yes.
morning. Do we have
Yes.
to be on Zoom to?
No. I'll just make it available. I don't want to invade the privacy of 35 people simultaneously. So yeah, you
And
have
how-
like 2 hours. Go ahead.
Will it be like 40 questions like the homework or?
The number of questions, you'll see them. So you got limited time, so you won't have many questions, but still you'll have enough questions that you would have to prepare. Don't leave your to the last second, okay? Don't say because the exam is open note, I don't need to study. You won't have time to study at the same time during your exam. This is very important, okay? I'll talk about it in detail and on the Moodle, I'll post it before the final, but please study. Don't leave it for the exam time. Don't say that because it's an open note exam, I don't need to study, because you do. Now, last time we're taking attendance, Brandon Atkins. Here. Noah Albertson.
Here.
Adil Al-Ghamdi.
Here.
Devin Ahmed.
Here.
Alex Battistoni.
Here.
Andrew Battistoni.
Here.
Jessica Beltrani.